But I believe that by overwhelming majority in all the Americas, you and I, in the long run, and if it be necessary, you and I will act together to protect, to defend, by every means at our command.
Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we discuss leaders, their decisions, and how they shape the world we live in today. Welcome to the History in Motion podcast, where we journey through time to understand the minds that shaped our world. In this episode, we turn our gaze to ancient Athens to walk alongside one of the most influential philosophers of all time, Socrates. We explore the life of a man who led not by sword, but by thought, challenging the very foundations of Athenian society with his relentless questioning. From the bustling agora to the hushed courtroom, we delve into the profound philosophical ventures that ignited minds and stirred the status quo. Witness the drama of Socrates' trial, a pivotal moment that tested the ideals of democracy and free speech. We examine the leadership qualities of a man who chose integrity over compromise, a thinker who shaped the course of Western philosophy, yet fell victim to the fears and politics of his time. Join us in the History in Motion podcast as we navigate the complex legacy of Socrates, exploring his life, his teachings, and his ultimate sacrifice as it continues to resonate through the ages. Today, we seek wisdom in the echoes of history.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the History in Motion podcast, where today we're throwing it back to ancient Greece, and we have the pleasure of introducing the first philosopher that we've studied on the History in Motion podcast, and that is the great Socrates of Athens in ancient Greece. So, we're throwing it all the way back to a time when Greece is separated to warring city-states. Science is not really even a thing, but there's these men who are starting to think a little bit differently, and that gets them into a little bit of trouble because when you don't follow the status quo, it doesn't typically work out well for you back in this time where we're looking at gods and very ritualistic practices. So for Socrates, it doesn't end well. Spoiler alert right off the bat. We're going to focus today on his life, but also what brings him up to the great trial of Socrates, where he's convicted of condemning the youth and corrupting the youth, and also basically being an atheist and not, praising the standard Greek gods. And there's a really, really cool story around him and trying to defend himself and how he even gets to that point. So I think it'll be an interesting one today as we kind of go through his life and see how it comes up to the trial, and then ultimately just kind of see why he would even be accused of something like this and why his thoughts and teachings are so well renowned and thought of today.
Yeah, I'm surprised it took us this long to get to a philosopher in one of our episodes, but I'm very excited for this one. I think the more research I did, the more some of like the contradictions and paradigms that came out of this were like, the whole idea of like, social uniformity versus intellectual progression, right? Like with Socrates, I find that, there's someone kind of challenging the status quo, thinking at the razor's edge of intellectual thought and philosophical thinking. But at the same time, right, you don't want to get too outside of the social uniformity that everyone's kind of looking to contain and uphold. And I think his story is quite unique in that sense.
I think so. And you look at this period in time too. This is not a unified Greece. This is not a unified really anything at this point. So you can tell the fear of non-uniformity can lead to betrayal and, selling out to the enemy. And it's your fellow Greeks at this point too. It's the city of Sparta and Athens are always at each other's necks. And then eventually the Persians show up and that creates a whole nother problem. So there's really a lack of stability in this region. And so you can kind of find this, love for uniformity because it kind of keeps things stable. But also you have this golden age of thought and philosophy all coming out of this area. And for a few specifically men, this is a great opportunity, right? To try out these different ideas and to actually have time to think and not just fight in wars or try to survive because there is a lot of prosperity. So I think it comes with the territory. You're trying to find this stability, but as a consequence, you've created all this prosperity for your people. And then that's going to trickle into people are going to start thinking a little bit different and asking some questions that maybe as a leader, you're not too happy with. But again, it comes with the territory. You want to be prosperous. You're going to have this sort of knowledge flowing through your society, whether you like it or not.
It's an interesting reality, right? Like when you're working all day, every day and laboring and, tilling the fields, you don't really have the time to think about the big questions about, why are we here? What are we doing? It is in many sense, philosophy is a bit of a luxury to be able to kind of sit back and think about these big, broad questions. And I think, it really gets to the heart, or at least like an underpinning of some of the resources and the growth of financial and, just kind of the standard of living that's happening at this point in time where Socrates is.
For sure. It's not, you can't be a hunter and come back and be like, I don't have any food for the family because I went for a walk and started thinking about why the trees are green and the sky is blue and tried to figure all of that out. So you definitely have to be born into a society where you're allowed to have these thoughts and it's not condemned immediately, but also you need to, like you said, you have to be able to have everything that you need to survive and have, spare time really, which is kind of interesting now that we talk about it. Like spare time is a much more modern concept than it really was back then.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the things that's so interesting about like philosophy in and of itself, because it really is just an exercise in kind of pondering and doing the mental gymnastics to, find some sort of rational answer for, why the universe exists the way it does, why do we operate the way we do? And I think this is probably a great kind of pivot point to kind of introduce not just Socrates, because, like philosophically speaking, this episode is more of like an intellectual history lesson almost in a way. Our focus is Socrates, and I think most people in the Western world who are in any way, shape, or form kind of familiar with philosophy and how it's kind of taught in modern education, Socrates is considered the father of Western philosophy. But the reality is there were philosophers before him. The pre-Socratics, as they're kind of lumped all together, they're known primarily for their attempts to kind of understand the universe and seek rational explanations for natural phenomena. So essentially you see this kind of divergence or moving away from mythological interpretation. I think it's important, something to keep in mind. Essentially, many of them were completely and totally wrong about their assumptions or rational understandings. And I think that's fine. Like most things in philosophy or, scientific exploration, they laid a foundation or at least gave an initial attempt to provide an answer to questions that most people weren't concerned with and provided a starting point for other philosophers. And if we kind of look at pre-Socratic thinking as a whole, I think some of the key characteristics that I came away with when I was just doing my research, like there's kind of some couple of big buckets. So there's this idea of natural philosophy. So they focused heavily on understanding the cosmos, natural phenomenon, the underlying principles of the universe. They're kind of considered the first scientists in Western history for their efforts to explain the natural world in terms of, natural laws rather than supernatural causes. And I think that's a very, very powerful and important shift to not just use this kind of God of the gaps analysis, which is if we don't understand it, the gods are responsible for it. There's this real shift in trying to use our, human faculties to make sense of the world around us.
It's just that general human curiosity, right? I think is what you're saying, right? So even in this piece, like you were saying, it's almost a substitute for science, because science as a concept doesn't really come around until maybe Galileo in the 14th, 15th century. So this piece of, why is the world the way it is? It kind of leaks into this almost scientific method in a sense without it properly being defined. But I love the fact that it's curiosity of why do things work the way they do? And whenever we see a society with this level of curiosity, there's always some sort of advancement, whether it's technologically, whether it's from a political standpoint. And, we see the peaks and valleys throughout history where people are told not to think and don't question anything. And we kind of see just a plateau of human civilization. But then when we look at the Greeks, this is where we see a huge uptick in, like, we see the invention of democracy and all of these things coming out of this type of intellectual curiosity that kind of springboards things forward. But I find it interesting that it kind of covers so many bases, and science is just such a core part of it, where today we don't really think of scientific philosophy as much as probably we did, or maybe even at all, because science is science. We have a proper scientific method for it. And we go test stuff and we do what we need to do from a scientific perspective. But for some of the things we don't know as much about, like maybe some human behavior or how the brain works, it starts to leak back into philosophy a little bit. So I almost kind of see it as this substitute for things we can't explain or maybe could never explain, which I think is kind of interesting because it kind of is that healthy balance between what can we explain, what can we test versus hey, what do we think the idea is? And that's when you have the classic, you think of Socrates and all these old guys with big beards arguing about what the answer should be. And I think it's just a great picture of kind of what this time really encompasses.
Yeah, I think you nailed it, Paul. This was kind of my takeaway as well. We talked about natural philosophy quickly, but you also see this kind of obsession with cosmology and metaphysics. So again, this interest in understanding not just the origins, but the structures of the universe. This whole idea of like, what are the fundamental substances of reality? What are we made out of? Now we know like atoms, neurons, protons, electrons, but you can see some of these like early scientific thought, and I'm sure that word we're projecting backwards, but you can definitely see elements of that. There's also a bit of ethical and political philosophy. I think to a lesser extent, Socratic thought, with Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, this definitely was something that springboarded into a much larger kind of school of thought. But the pre-Socratics were also kind of concerned with ethical, political thought. They often pondered about the nature of justice and ideal society. But from my perspective, and to your point, Paul, it seems like a lot of it was really focused on natural philosophy, metaphysics, trying to understand what the world and the universe is made out of. And I have a quick list here of some notable pre-Socratic philosophers and some of the big, contributions that they did make during their time. The big one, Pythagoras. I think we all have heard of Pythagoras, willingly or unwillingly. His contributions for mathematics. He had significant metaphysical theories, particularly regarding numbers. And there's a bit of a mystical element here in terms of their significance in the cosmos. I don't know if you went into this at all, Paul, but Pythagoras, there's a group of historians who sometimes label Pythagoras as a bit of a cult leader because he had a bit of a commune. There were certain ceremonial and ritualistic aspects of how they kind of mysticized numbers and how they fit into into society at the time. It is very interesting. It's definitely something we weren't taught in math class. I assume when we talked about the Pythagorean theorem.
Yeah, there's always this element of that, right? Of you have this person who's just super smart and trying to push forward his ideology. It always gets culty in some capacity. I think we even see it with Socrates too, right?
Yeah.
It's just the way it's par for the course, I think. And again, it's that balance of, yes, you need followers, but you don't need worshippers, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think it's a common thread we'll kind of see as we go through. But yes, I don't think that was lesson one when we were learning the Pythagorean theorem of this cult leader created this really great method that we still use today. But
I probably would have paid attention if they led with the cult leader thing. But exactly. So again, I think it goes to the point that some of the things that were discussed or used or like came up and were kind of documented and codified, even in this era, like in ancient times, is still relevant today and still used. And I think there's a couple of these kind of standouts that really struck a chord with me when I was doing some of this pre-Socratic research. So there's a guy named Democritus. So he's actually best known for his atomic theory of the universe. He proposed that everything is composed of indivisible and indestructible atoms, which is pretty wild to me to think that, this person, without any other scientific evidence or proof or tools or equipment, just through sheer like rational thinking and reasoning, going on what his predecessors may have taught, was able to kind of come up with this theory that is pretty close to what we know today. It's pretty remarkable.
It's unbelievable how to get down to that level. Like you hear the conversations around, the four elements, earth, wind, fire, air, and that's how everything's made up. And that would make sense for someone back then as you kind of observing the natural world. But to take it a step further and say, actually, all four of those things are made up of the same building blocks, just rearranged in different ways. Crazy. It's pretty brilliant. And yeah, I would love to have, get inside his head and really understand how he came to that thought, because was it more just like, yeah, that just makes sense and that's the way he's always thought? Or did he go in and go through some sort of really deep thought process to come to that? But either it's just a really lucky guess or absolute brilliance. I like to think it's brilliance because I think that just makes the story a little bit more interesting, but not a bad thing to come up with.
No, it's incredible. Like, it actually was amazing to hear that, because I think when we think about ancient history, ancient philosophy, because this is ancient, we quickly kind of dismiss it because we don't think they're able to come to the conclusions or rationales that we do. But I think it just goes to the depth and breadth that some of these thinkers were able to kind kind of accomplish and the conclusions they were able to make that are so close to a fundamental truth that they would probably they would never know was actually accurate enough, which is kind of sad in a way. But I think the point that I'm trying to make is that philosophy did not start with Socrates. There were many influential thinkers before him, and they kind of set the stage for the broader development of Western philosophy that would really kind of, expand and leapfrog with Socrates and his followers and kind of what came post-Socratic thinking. Because I think these inquiries into, the nature of reality, the focus on rational explanations, exploring ethical and political themes, they essentially provided that springboard for Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and then, subsequent philosophical traditions. So I think, again, the big takeaway here is that they were accurate about some stuff. Much of it was wrong, but it does represent a massive shift from mythological thinking to rational explanations of the world, which really, to your point that you just made, Paul, is the beginning of kind of this scientific thought in Western culture.
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head too, just saying this is not where it starts. I think as we described, philosophy is really just being curious and thinking in a different way. And Socrates was definitely not the first person to ever think outside the box. That's probably been happening since humans were able to think. But the main difference here is philosophy is now mainstream. We know people's names. People, again, worship them, for lack of a better term, in some capacity during their lifetime, where before that it was more to the fringes of society where people would start to think about these ideas, and, death was most likely the answer for thinking these things. But to be able to walk down the street and have intellectual debates with anybody you want, and that's kind of celebrated to an extent. Yeah, that's a brand new concept that kind of springboards, Greece. And then we see the Romans almost having this love for ancient Greece. And it comes a lot from this free inquiry and thinking about things in a different way. And every time we kind of see that throughout society, we take a step forward. And I think it does start with the Greeks.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that really does speak to, like, if we, kind of pivot back to thinking about Socrates, if we look at his lifetime, I also think it speaks a lot to the kind of the intellectual landscape of Greece, particularly in Athens, and this kind of transformation that's going on. And the term I kept coming across, which I wasn't familiar with at the time, was kind of this golden age of Athens, which is, I guess it runs from like 480 to 404 BC. It's a bit of a defining period in Greece. It's characterized by these kind of, unparalleled achievements in culture, art, philosophy, and politics. Under, like notable leadership from Pericles, Athens becomes kind of this epicenter of Greek civilization. It embodies the ideals of democracy where, free Athenian men are able to participate and governance. I think you also have kind of like the architectural, transformation that's happening with the Parthenon, which is this kind of, symbol of Athenian artistic and architectural prowess and genius. I guess like in terms of like philosophy, it almost sounds like a bit of an enlightenment, right? Like I don't like using that word very often, but there seems to be this element of kind of intellectual growth and prosperity that's underpinned by this more, civil kind of growth as well.
Yeah, it really is a type of enlightenment. I think that is the right term for it. I know the enlightenment is its own thing, but it is in a sense this open expression and really advancement of human society. And the crazy thing is there's not that many people really living in Athens at this time. So from what I was looking at, there's around 250,000 people in Athens, but only about 35,000 of them are men of, who have civic rights. So not slaves, native born Athenians. So there's only really about 35,000 men who are really able to drive this change, which is not a lot of people. So I think, as we start to look at Athenian society, you see this tradition start to come into place too, where, the value of education is very, very high. The ability to converse with your fellow man is very, very important. But there's also a strong military tradition as well. So you kind of have the three things that you need for a society to function in this time. Like if you don't have a strong military tradition, you're going to get eaten up by your neighbors very, very quickly. But if you don't have the free inquiry, you just kind of become a warring state that's just raiding and not really trying to do anything, I guess, of value. Just, hey, we're good at war, so that's what we're going to do. And you kind of see the Athenians have the ability to do all three of those things and kind of keep the Spartans at bay for the most part through their strong naval activities. And the other thing I thought was interesting was, why is this time period, do we know so much about it, but also what gives it the ability to grow as quickly as it does? I think one of the big things is the literacy rate is growing, which is important, but also what the Greek language has become at this time is quite advanced for languages. So when we look at the Egyptians and they're using hieroglyphics and different symbols, We see some more simplistic languages throughout the world that are written down. But at this time with Greece, like you have the full Greek alphabet's been created. You have vowels in words, for example, is a huge thing. So now this ability to convey thought in a different way orally is obviously very, very important. But now you can start to write and you can share that knowledge with other people and it can get passed down. So I think that's where I think is the number one reason probably why we know so much about this time period is they're able to convey their ideas in a way that most other societies can't at this point in time. And even to that point, we have, you'll see a typical Athenian family will have children. They'll usually have a slave who's literate as well. And their job is to be the teacher to their children to make sure that they understand, the typical things that an Athenian would learn, but also to be able to read and write. So this literacy rate is continuing to increase. And I think it goes without saying that, literacy in 400 BC is, in the single percentages worldwide. This is a very rare thing. So to have a society where everybody's able to read and write is probably one of those main reasons why we're able to springboard forward and have some of these ideas that you don't really see anywhere else in the world.
I think there's so much there, Paul. I think there's things that stand out to me. And I think it kind of goes back to the initial point that we kind of kicked off the episode with is that there's got to be a lot going on and a lot going on well for a group of, for your massive population to be able to dedicate time to these kind of new oral and written traditions that are happening around you. And I think Socrates kind of personifies that to a certain degree, right? He is very much, able to develop his Socratic method, his way of and style of thinking, because he is able to do so in an environment that's kind of conducive to it. And if you look at just, the three things that stand out to me about Socrates is that obviously philosophical inquiry, that's why we're talking about him. He kind of personified this spirit of intellectual exploration that kind of cuts across Athenian society. I think he's notoriously famous for engaging in public debates in the marketplace and kind of questioning conventional beliefs and wisdom. There's this, again, the focus of on ethics and virtue. He believed that knowledge was key to virtue and that no one does wrong willfully but out of ignorance, which I think is such a lovely idea. I don't know. I think that's such a modern thing, that to be able to see that most people just don't know. And that's why they may act that the way they do. And I think that kind of perspective shifted the focus of philosophy from the natural world, which we saw with the pre-Socratic thinkers, to human issues of morality and the nature of human character.
Yeah, definitely. And you look at this time period, right? Survival is the number one thing for a lot of people. So I think it is a very, very apt way of looking at it, of people don't understand why they're doing what they're doing. Like, we don't know about evolution and, the need to survive and pass on your genes and that kind of stuff. And so when people aren't able to step away from just their biological instincts of stay alive and pass on your genes, it's essentially a level of ignorance where you're just going to be acting on those things all the time. So I think for Socrates to be able to take a step back and say, okay, this person's murdering somebody or stealing their food. They're not doing it because they're necessarily a bad person. They're just doing it because they don't understand why they're doing it. And again, it's now we're getting into he's using this idea of just observation to explain very fundamental psychological and biological processes, which I think is what makes all of this so beautiful. Is these are just ideas that now we need to go, not essentially prove, but work onto a different level and expand them out. And then eventually 2000 years later, Charles Darwin's able to figure out, the exact root cause of what Socrates was saying, which I think is just kind of crazy that everything just starts with an idea. And eventually we get to a scientific theory based around just a simple idea.
Yeah, we get as close as we can to actually being able to empirically point to and prove something with a definitive answer, right? And I think that's some of the most powerful stuff about philosophy in this era that kind of I find so captivating, because you see so many of these fundamental truths just kind of laid out, and it's just through, with Socrates, obviously it's the Socratic method, which is, we're not a philosophy podcast, so we won't get into the nitty gritty details of the Socratic method, but essentially, it's a form of cooperative, argumentative dialogue. And, I love the idea of it. I wish more people did it, but essentially it stimulates kind of critical thinking to draw out ideas and underlying presuppositions. So essentially, you're just going to ask a series of questions to challenge assumptions and reveal the extent of one's knowledge to whether someone can actually definitively know something. It's a question and answer format. It requires critical thinking, and really, if done well, it will reveal the contradictions of the person you are, having this argumentative dialogue.
I'm very clearly seeing the pros and cons to this from, an engineering perspective, for example. Something that engineers do is we do something called first principles. Break everything down, ask the questions, and get to the true root cause so you can solve it. And that works lovely when you're trying to solve a mechanical problem or an electrical problem. The other side is, don't talk religion and politics at the dinner table and that kind of thing. Yep. Yeah. And you just you're trying to break someone down to open up, to expose their lack of understanding over an idea. Nobody wants that to happen to them. Nobody wants to be exposed as not really fully understanding something. They want a simple way of looking at the world, and now you're trying to break them down. And we'll get into, Socrates going around, and sure, he's having these great intellectual debates with other intellectuals, and they're really challenging each other, and there's some great things that come out of it. But, the local butcher who's just cutting his meat doesn't want to be berated by Socrates on why he doesn't know the true meaning of whatever he's working on or whatever the topic of the day is. And so you can start to see this kind of piece where people are like, oh no, here comes Socrates again. He's going to start talking, versus some people are like, oh great, here's Socrates. We're going to have a great conversation and learn a ton. So there's definitely a balancing act with him. But I think it's that weird kind of, when you really break it down of, know your time, know your place, know your audience, and it can work really well, but it can also lead to some really upset people.
I think in a perfect world where people have like intellectual humility and are willing to own their shortcomings, it's great. But people get very defensive. And I found an example. I wanted to provide an example to our listeners to kind of make it a little bit more real. So this is actually a dialogue from Plato. So Plato was Socrates' most famous student. So this is written posthumously. So in this dialogue, which is essentially this kind of discussion style narrative that's very popular among philosophers, Plato writes about Socrates, who encounters Euthyphro, a religious expert outside the court, and engages him in a discussion about the nature of piety. Okay, a word that's not used very often, and I think even in the era of Socrates, a word that is increasingly difficult to pin down. And this is the point that the conversation goes. So Socrates is about to be tried for impiety, and Euthyphro claims to understand what piety is, and he is prosecuting his own father for a murder and a decision he believes is pious. So Socrates asks him to define piety. He responds that piety is what he is doing, prosecuting wrongdoers, which includes his father. So you can see he's kind of using his own definition here. It's very loose. So further inquiry, Socrates finds this definition, as he would, very unsatisfactory, and asks him to provide a more general definition, not just an example. He says that piety is what is dear to the gods. So through a series of questions, Socrates leads him to realize that since the gods often quarrel among themselves, that what is dear to one god may not be dear to another, and that therefore his definition could lead to many contradictions. Essentially, he begins to attempt to refine his definition, but Socrates' persistent questioning exposes further problems and inconsistencies, and the dialogue ultimately ends without a clear definition of piety, but with a deeper understanding of the complexity of the concept. So again, it's just, again, I think to your point, Paul, it's like, what are first principles? Can we get to a foundational level of agreement and rationality that we can use to build upon?
I like that story too, because it shows why democracy flourishes so much in Athens, because of this type of ability to just break down ideas and ask the right types of questions, so you can have these types of debates. And in this case, it's a very important legal matter. Like, someone's life is on the line here. Someone potentially is on trial for their life. And the reasoning that comes in is essentially a weak argument, according to Socrates. And he's able to, sure, they don't get to an answer, but now it's getting the people thinking of, okay, is this how we should be conducting our legal system, based on definitions of piety that, don't really, we look at today and go, okay, that doesn't make any sense at all. And then I also kind of like the piece on how the gods are always fighting. And I think that's just a very interesting part of ancient Greece is, it's very different than maybe the people who've grown up in like a Western Christian culture, where you have one God who's all good, knows everything, and can do no wrong. Where the Greeks, they look at their gods and go, oh yeah, they're very human. They make a lot of mistakes. They're very jealous. They don't like each other a lot of the time. So in Socrates, I think it's a really great argument to make when he's saying, yeah, the gods fight all the time. Why can't we argue sometimes and try to figure things out in different ways? So yeah, I like that part as well, because I think it just kind of sums up this time period in a little bit, maybe quite well, just on the basis of what the religious elements are, because obviously they're very, very important, but then also that you're able to even have that type of conversation, but then also that someone's able to just accuse somebody of something and then point to piety and say, yeah, that's the reason, and let's have a debate for this person's life, which is, maybe a bit of a flaw in their justice system at this time.
Well, and I think some of it even holds true today, right? Like, think about, as you were speaking, I'm thinking about the word or concept of justice. Like, I'm sure there's a Webster's definition of justice, but as a concept, you ask 10 people to define justice, you're going to get 10 maybe somewhat different ideas of what that actually looks like in a meaningful way. And I think, at its core, much of what we talk about in democracy, these are very complex concepts that, we use these words, regularly. But to actually be able to fully understand the breadth and depth and complexity of such concepts is where, I think like the Socratic method is so interesting, because I think it thrives when people can, recognize one's own ignorance, as I think Socrates really pushed for. It really emphasizes the pursuit of truth, regardless of all else. And it's still this kind of very fundamentally used tool in like education, right? To foster like critical thinking and dialogue, to be able to question and analyze and be able to get to a basic understanding of something like this.
Definitely. And I think this might be a good point to pivot into, Athenian democracy a little bit, just as you kind of introduced it there, and why, I think it's a great segue into why the Socratic method is so important at this time. And it really kind of is byproduct, but also a source of this Athenian democratic process. So again, democracy is being invented for the first time here. This is a world where kings and lords and emperors, or whatever you want to call it, noble birth is the most important thing. What's running through your blood is the most important thing. But the Athenians see it a bit differently. They don't conform to that kind of world. They have an assembly, which was basically a central institution of their democracy. All citizens, so when we say citizens, men who are born in Athens, who are not slaves, and who have done some sort of military service, have the ability to be part of the Athenian democratic process. So all citizens had the right to attend meetings, which were held about 40 times a year on a specific hill that was in Athens. The assembly, they decided on laws, decrees, policies, really everything you would see from a modern democracy. They also had the judicial part of Athens as well. So, how are we going to conduct trials? How are we going to elect officials as well? And then also, are we going to declare war? Are we not going to declare war? So really think of US Congress, British or Canadian House of Commons. Like, it's just this assembly of people who are starting to come together to make decisions on things. The council was another part of the democratic process, and it was chosen by essentially drawing straws or drawing something as a random process, similar to how we saw it in Florence when we talked about Lorenzo de' Medici and Machiavelli. And they essentially prepared the agenda for the assembly. So their members served for 1 year and were responsible for the day-to-day administration of the city-state. They'd manage things like finances, infrastructure, all the state activities that needed to happen. And some people are actually paid for their services, which I thought was kind of interesting. We typically see when we talk about early democracies, it's a more of a volunteer sort of thing where it's just something that you want to be involved in because it's kind of your civic duty. But one of the things the Athenians realized is if you're a very poor citizen, you don't have time to be going to these assemblies or working on administrative processes. So they actually provided some pay to these people. So you could be the lowest of the low in Athens, but you had the ability to serve as in the assembly or serve in this council. So you could take part in the democratic process because it was your right as an Athenian citizen, with a few caveats. But, it wasn't just for the rich and powerful. It was really for everybody, at least so the idea goes.
Yeah. I think that's so interesting, right? Like, well, one, the comparison between like Venice or Florence and, what we're talking about today, it's always those kind of silver linings that cut across, centuries and centuries and centuries is always so cool to see how things are implemented. But to see the formation of democracy and what it would lead to today, right? Like it's one of those things that just kind of boggles the mind.
And it disappears, right? For so long until the Renaissance, really. And then it comes back, and then it kind of dips away, and then it comes back. But our man of the hour, Socrates, did not like any of this. He really disliked democracy. And you'd be thinking, for someone who loves this free inquiry and loves to be able to have these open debates, you would think he'd want some sort of democracy. He'd want everybody to be able to stand up, plead their case, and make the best decision. But he had this belief that voting was a skill. It wasn't something that you could just give to anybody. You needed to be taught how to think and how to process certain types of questions, and then you should have the ability to vote. So he wanted to heavily restrict who was allowed to make those types of decisions. And for him, it was essentially a mob rules sort of thing that he was worried about, of people don't know enough about a concept. Everyone gets riled up. Everyone votes for something, but they're actually not trained in the right way to think through these problems deeply like he is, or any of the people that he teaches. And so he's kind of like, well, that's just a way for mob rule to take over. We're not actually going to get anything done. And so he has this kind of analogy where he's in a debate with someone about democracy, and he says, okay, you'd want to travel on a ship. And he says, who would you like to captain that ship? And the person responds, well, I would want the most qualified, most experienced sailor, captain of a ship that you can find. And he goes, great. So why do you say that any old person can run a country? Why can't we just vote somebody in? He goes, you need to pick the best person who's trained in the best way possible to be able to run a country. And he basically says, by doing just voting like this, if we're not able to vote in a way where we understand the objective strengths and weaknesses of a person, or you don't have the ability to think through those processes, we're going to pick the wrong person and it's not going to work out. And he has this fear of demagoguery where, the masses are swept away by this smooth talker who uses their political skill to, woo the masses and takes control. And he has another analogy, which is great, where he compares a doctor to a person who sells sweets and candies and lovely things that you would want to eat. The seller would come up and say, I have all these wonderful things that taste great and you're going to love them. And then he goes to the doctor, what are you selling? And the doctor goes, well, I'm saying don't do any of those things because it's actually not good for your health. But even though it gives you short-term pleasure, but then also the doctor's going to give you medicine and maybe take you through painful procedures. And that's his selling point. In the long run, it's good for you. But in the short term, that kind of indulgence for the sweets and the sugar and all of those sort of things are so important. And, as humans, we'll jump at those short-term games all the time. And Socrates sees this and he says, there's a really great opportunity for someone to sell things that are great in the short term. And then we see this kind of hero/mini god worship of these types of people. And then we essentially have, a king, for lack of a better term, who's, only in power because of their ability to talk and be politically savvy, but not actually on their objective skill. So he sees it as, hey, democracy doesn't work for that purpose, which I don't think is maybe the most wrong thing to look at it. It's obviously a balancing act, but I think it's a very, very good understanding of where democracy can go wrong. If we look at democracy across the world today, there's a lot of, there's some smooth talkers out there who know how to get their way into power. It's not always the smartest person who understands what they need to do to make their country great. So I think it's a great kind of overview of democracy then, but also very, very good description of where it is today.
What an incredibly accurate analysis of the potential shortcomings of democracy. There's a quote, I don't remember where I heard it, but it kind of stuck with me. It's about democracy. It's from a movie. Someone says, democracy could be two wolves and a sheep voting on who to eat for dinner.
I love that.
Right. And I think, like, while you were speaking, Paul, I think for our listeners, it's probably very hard to not see some of those shortcomings in the modern era. Some of the things that he was fearful of, that short-sightedness, we think in 4-year cycles here in the Great White North, and it makes sense. It totally checks out. I'm not saying it's a totally flawed system, but I can see his analysis and the skills that he's kind of talking about of being a fully educated citizen to be able to make a vote that's meaningful for long-term progress. I think it's great analysis. Yeah,
he is able to really break these things down, and I think he has a very good understanding of how human beings are able to process complex ideas.
Yep.
And he understands, I think rightfully, most of us, including the two of us, don't really know how to break down most concepts, especially when it's military or deep political issues. And again, that's why you don't talk politics at the dinner table, because everybody's going to have such convictions about things, and to be able to break down every single idea and really understand it, that's your full-time job, really. And that's probably why you have full-time politicians, because we hope that's their job, right? So Yeah, just a great overview. And I think it's one of those things where you can see very, very clearly why it disappears so fast, because you can have someone elected and then just take over and kind of make themselves an emperor or a king because of this kind of demagoguery that we see. And we see it all over the world until really almost the modern era where democracies are actually, quite stable. So yeah, he's able to point those things out. And I think he's right. And it really just takes some time for, things to be stable and, the Enlightenment to come forward and all of these sort of things. And then also people to be able to see how kings and queens and ruling based on bloodline has some disastrous consequences for a lot of people. It kind of swings things back into this direction. And thankfully, I think for all of us, democracy has stuck around. And, Socrates maybe didn't have his choice of things, but that's just the way the world works.
Yeah. It's interesting. When I was thinking through this the last couple of days, there seems to be this kind of paradox that exists with Socrates and Greece at this point in time, especially with his analysis, right? Like, you have a society that is increasingly democratic, that's open about discussion and intellectual thought. It's burgeoning, it's flourishing. But here comes this guy who is, really on the fringes of his discourse. He's, really pushing it with how analytical and critical is of some of these potential systems and institutions and some of the weak points that many people may be aware of, but don't necessarily want to say out loud. And here he is, in the ultimate search of truth, is willing to not only say them out loud, but continually say them to be able to kind of raise awareness about it. Because in his mind, this seems like the virtuous thing to do. Yeah,
it comes down to that, again, what is his moral obligation to do these things? I guess the virtuous thing, as you were saying.
Yep.
And, it's going to get him into some trouble, though. That's the downside of all of this is, especially in a time where, free expression is not, written right into a constitution. It gets him into some trouble. But I think real quick, we haven't really jumped into his life at all. I think we should do that real quick. And this is what happens with us. We start talking about the grander things. But again, his bio's not really that interesting. I think that was one thing when I started reading it. I was like, he's just kind of a guy and he just shows up, and his ideas and how he conducts himself are interesting. And then obviously his trial is interesting. So real quick, we'll just kind of power through his early life, which is very typical for an Athenian male at this time. So he's born to a stoneworker and a midwife who live in the suburbs of Athens. And so, as we said before, this is a great start. He's not born into poverty. He's not born into vast amounts of wealth, but he's living comfortably. He's born in Athens, so he's got that citizenship. He's a male, and he's from a family that's got some influence and can provide him an education. So he's really set from birth, decent at least hand. At that point. Yeah.
Decent hand to be
the hand is good. Yeah. It's not a royal flush that he's been dealt right away, but it's something he can work with. And, he follows a typical education of a typical Athenian. He learns laws and customs of Athens, basic skills of reading and writing. He even received extra lessons in various fields such as athletics, poetry, music. So just really trying to be an all around educated person. And we just the next kind of things we learn about Socrates is it's just he was married twice. He had 3 kids. He did some military service in one of the wars with Sparta. And we just don't really know a lot about his life. But what we do know comes from people writing about him. It's all second sources. Like, he never wrote an autobiography or anything, or wrote anything down at all. Never, even his ideas he didn't write down.
That's a great point.
All the stuff we really know comes from Plato, who is his pupil. And Plato would start documenting a lot of these stuffs, and another historian who was his pupil would start to write down a lot of these things. So we're getting a lot of these things really secondhand. But really the next thing we know is just how he was seen amongst his fellow Athenians. So he was known for being incredibly ugly, with like a really large kind of pig nose, had really bulging eyes, kind of a bigger guy with a big belly. He neglected personal hygiene, didn't like to bathe, walked barefoot. He had one coat that he wore and just wore it all the time. He also was very into limiting the pleasures of life. So food, sex, and other things like that. He didn't give them up altogether, but really tried to, I think in his eyes, it was a way of kind of corrupting the mind a little bit, of going after these pleasures of, if I can minimalize this, I'm going to have more time to have a clear mind and think. He was known for being attracted to young men, really young boys at this point. So before everyone goes, oh my God, that's awful, which in the modern day absolutely is. That was a very common and accepted practice in Greece, where, men would be with men and women, especially older men with younger with younger men or younger boys in some situations, which is kind of a weird, commonly accepted practice in Greece, and even when we move into like the Roman period as well. But Plato describes that he was, he had a passion for young men, but he resisted because he was interested in educating their souls. That's what he was truly interested in. So I'm sure Plato's doing Socrates a few favors there and kind of
little PR bust.
Yeah,
there,
exactly. He didn't have a PR department, but he had a pupil who thought very fondly of him. And like we talked about, he was known for walking the market, challenging a variety of people on many different things in lengthy debates, which obviously didn't really work out well for him in a variety of ways. Like we said, people would just feel foolish, and he would actually like try to embarrass people as he was speaking to them. So, nobody wants to be embarrassed, let alone in public around your peers, or, while you're running your business, you're chopping up some meat, or you're trying to sell whatever, or you're working as a blacksmith, and Socrates is coming in and telling you don't really know the true meaning of your craft or something like that around people. Like it's interesting. But look, I just want to make my swords. I just want to make my shoes. I just want to make whatever I'm making and get on with my day. And there's a lot of people who are like that. So he definitely was on the negative side of a lot of people, and obviously gets him in trouble at the end of his life.
It's so funny because like so much of what you're saying is still so relevant today, right? It's like, I just want to go do my work and I want to come home and I don't want to think about these things. And there's always that one guy who's like, no, let's take this deeper.
Yeah.
And Socrates, everyone knows a Socrates.
They do, yeah. It's the guy who's like, yeah, did you see what, Trudeau or Biden or somebody said last night? And you're like, no, and I don't care. I just want to do my day and get moving. And
I don't care about it.
Yeah. Or, hey, have we really thought about truly what's the meaning behind what we're doing? It's like, yeah, maybe I can think about that one day. But today is, I want to get to 5 o'clock. I want to get home. I want to pour a glass of wine and enjoy my shows. Like it's the simplicity of life that I think Socrates doesn't really get, mainly because he probably does live quite a comfortable life. And, you're in Greece, like you're in paradise really at this point. So, he probably doesn't see some of those hardships, but it does catch up with him. So in 399 BC, Socrates was formally accused of corrupting the minds of the youth of Athens and worshiping false gods and failing to worship the gods of Athens. So one of the big flaws I see in kind of Athenian democracy and their legal system was any person can charge anybody of anything. So think about, you just don't like somebody or you had a bad day. You can come up with trumped up charges and just say, hey, this person did this. And they're like, all right, well, we have to take this somewhat seriously. Not like in our society where the police have to go through a process. You have to get a judge involved. There's a public prosecutor who has to have enough evidence to actually go and convict somebody or charge them with a crime. So there's a lot of vendettas that are happening here where someone doesn't like somebody for whatever reason. They throw them up against charges and then they try to rile everybody up to be able to vote in the negative for somebody. And really, this is where I think Socrates could see the dangers of their democratic system, where not only can you get somebody riled up to pick a leader, but you can get people riled up around this type of legal system where, maybe you need a scapegoat for something. Maybe you need a head to roll because other things are going on. And it just kind of, it's the scapegoat process, right? Of we can put all our problems on one person and pretend it's over without actually solving the problem. And for Socrates, it's a really tricky time because the Athenian-Spartan relationship is really not at a great point. And I think shortly after his death, the Spartans actually invade Athens. So there's this part of, things aren't good. There's some questioning about what's going on. And when the accusations are brought forward by a poet of all people named Meletus, he brings these accusations against Socrates and then he's up for trial. So it is a bit odd. It's not coming from, the council got together and really deliberated and thought about this. It's, he was brought forward. Obviously, the council has to take those allegations in and decide what to do, but it wasn't like it was drawn from a internal legal process that's trying to, prosecute criminals and things like that. So this was brought by just a regular public citizen.
It's an interesting kind of system for anyone to be able to charge or place charges against anyone at any time. What a slippery slope. And the administrative and operational cost of that, I imagine, would be immense from just a bureaucracy perspective, because you'd have to be able to, how would you manage that? If anyone is I could then sue you at any time, Paul, for anything, and you could then sue me, and everyone would be suing each other. That seems like, you know what, maybe Socrates and his his criticisms were kind of onto something at this point.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where there's people go, all right, you're being ridiculous. You've sued this guy 10 times and you lost 9 times. Go away. But for some people who are like, yeah, I'm really sick of Socrates. He's being a bit of a jerk, and I really don't want to have to ever speak with him again. Oh, he's some old man, and maybe he's not contributing as much to society anymore. What do I care if someone throws some charges against him and people maybe have a more indifferent view? So he's eventually put up on trial, and he has the ability to defend himself. So against the allegations of corrupting the youth, Socrates answers that he has never corrupted anyone intentionally, since corrupting someone would carry the risk of being corrupted back in return, and therefore would be how does he describe this here? It wouldn't be something that anybody would want to do, because being corrupted is undesirable. So why would you do it? So it's a very philosophical answer to something. It's like, I would never do that, because then it would come back to me, and that's a silly thing. But it's not providing evidence in the way we would see a legal system today, saying, well, I didn't do this, and here's the proof to show it. It was more of, you wouldn't be able to go up into court today and say, well, my thoughts on this are I would never do it because I don't want it to happen to me. It doesn't really work like that, but I think for the time, it's definitely a noble effort. And then on the second charge, Socrates asks for clarification. What do you mean I'm, against the gods? And Meletus responds by repeating the accusation that Socrates is an atheist. Socrates notes that the contradiction between atheism and worshiping false gods. He claims that he is God's gift to the Athenians, since his activities ultimately benefit the Athenians. Thus, in condemning him to death, Athens itself will be the greatest loser. After that, he says, even though no human can reach wisdom, seeking it can be the best thing someone can do, implying money and prestige are not as precious as commonly thought. So you can't kill me. I love the gods because I'm their gift to you as people, which again, just I think sums up Socrates in such a perfect way of, he is incredibly cocky about himself. Yeah. And look, you're on trial for your life here. You may want to come up with something a little bit better, but I think for him, he's an older man. He sees the end coming soon anyways. He's going down swinging, and he's not going to stop. So after this attempt to kind of free himself and kind of exonerate himself, he is convicted and sentenced to die, but it's not like a sweeping one way or the other. 280 jurors find him guilty, while 220 found him innocent. So it was actually quite close. It wasn't a unanimous decision. So Socrates asked for exiles, just let me go sit in a home and somewhere and just give me some food and I'll live out my days and won't bother anybody. Yeah. But this was denied, and he was killed by being forced to drink hemlock, which is a poisonous liquid, and was dead at the age of 71 in 3099 BC. So a really kind of sad ending to his life, but also something I think we can see where, I keep reading here. He says, I'm God's gift to the Athenians. It's again, you would love to have seen him live out to his life and have, a nice kind of normal ending. But again, we wouldn't be talking about him today if he didn't stir the pot a little bit, if he was just a regular guy that was asking some questions. I think socially, definitely didn't have the skills that you need to survive, but I think it's the inevitable end for someone who's so transformative to the world that he lives in. You're not going to be able to get away with this without some scrapes and some bruises along the way, and ultimately being sentenced to die at the age of 71. The fact that he even made it to 71, I still think is a testament, right?
Incredible. That's incredible. That's incredible. Yeah.
For someone who doesn't bathe or have any personal hygiene too, you think he'd be sick all the time and stuff, but maybe, they were built differently back then. I'm sure someone will say.
No, what a remarkable end, right? And I think, not to pick on philosophers, but I think if you're into philosophy, you definitely have some unique qualities about you. I've never met someone who spends time thinking about philosophy who, doesn't like having these very in-depth and grand discussions. And, they're often willing to kind of push the envelope on certain things that, most people who aren't into philosophy, probably one, don't consider, two, don't have the time for, or three, are just not interested in actually discussing. But I think, as we kind of get to the hour mark, Paul, the one thing that really sticks out to me about Socrates and his trial and his life, he almost becomes it doesn't almost, I think he does become a martyr in a way, right? For
sure.
His students and the philosophical thought and school that he kind of creates for, Plato and Aristotle. I really see him as this kind of person who, leads by example through his intellect, through his moral courage. Obviously his influence on others, it's hard not to be influenced by him, because it seems like, his pragmatic and rational thinking is almost magnetic in a certain way. And his kind of focus on constant self-examination and challenging the status quo, all ideals that I value, that I think are very, very important to always kind of push the envelope forward.
And I think without him, someone else, I'm sure, would have figured this out at some point. But we look at all the leaders throughout history, and even modern leaders too, of being able to break down concepts to their core problems and solve them in that way is pretty much the hallmark of any great leader. And so for a thought legacy that's so important, but the fact that when we look at societies that are at the peak of human civilization, we think of the Romans and then we think of the Renaissance. It all starts by studying the ancients, and it all comes back to the Greeks, and it all comes back to Socrates and Plato and Aristotle and all of these great thinkers, because their ideas are, I don't know if I would say the right ideas. They're the hard ideas, but maybe they are the right ideas in that sense. And we see, humanity slip into these areas in history where we kind of go after the easier thing where, hey, God is the only thing we need to worry about. Don't question anything. It's very safe. It's very easy on the mind, but it really doesn't progress anything. And that's why we have something like the Dark Ages. But when we come back and we think to that purely Socratic way of thinking, maybe not so much his social elements, but his Socratic level of thinking, we're able to proceed as a society and we're able to progress. And I come back to, is it the right way to think? I don't think I can say that. I don't think anybody can, but I think the outcome of it is so strong that I think you can maybe make an argument that, yes, this is the best way to think, but it's very, very hard to do so. And you probably don't have the time to do so. So that's why many, many people struggle with it, including the two of us. So yeah, I think it's a very, very fascinating end to his life and fascinating legacy that, I don't know if there's anybody who's had more of an impact throughout history than that we've talked about than Socrates. Just as I'm speaking here, it's, what part of society has he not touched in some way with his teaching? I don't think any part has gone untouched. So yeah, big props, I guess, to Socrates on being able to do what he did and be able to have this legacy that continued to be worked on and grow, and ideas that were built upon to get us to where we are today. And to think, the world that we are able to live in today is really kind of comes back to a lot of those thoughts and, evolved over 2,000 plus years.
Yeah, I think when people kind of give him credit for being the father of Western philosophy, I think it's a very apt title. I think
for sure
there is no one more deserving of that kind of label than he is, just because of how deeply embedded his thoughts, his works are still kind of discussed today, and how it laid the foundation of, what was to come with Plato and Aristotle after the fact. And what those three kind of giants did for Western philosophy, I think like every philosophy course that you take, in postgrad is going to start with these three at some point. Like, you can't get around it. And I think, it really is a credit to Socrates' work. And I think, if we're looking at like leadership and decision making, here is someone who knew exactly how he was going to make decisions, because it was so deeply embedded in his morals and integrities and his virtues that he would kind of always be aligned with and move forward with. And I think it's just a testament to his character.
For sure. I think you hit the nail on the head with, when it comes to leadership and decision making and, the legacy that he leaves. Everybody probably wants to follow this. It's just the practicality of it is where people struggle, right? It's like, yes, 100%. I would love to break down every single decision that I make into its true root cause and go through a proper analysis. And if you're able to do that, hey, hats off to you. But I think, that's the challenge that I think we see all leaders face is, I want to break things down, but I just, I don't have the time to do so, or my mind physically can't take it anymore. I just want a simple answer to something. And sometimes time is of the essence. And we see that with leaders all the time, right? Where we look at, invading armies rolling up. I don't have time to spend 2 weeks breaking down my decision into, deep, complex ideas to see what the right decision is, because if I don't do something in the next 20 minutes, there's going to be cannonballs or catapults flying over my walls of my city. So it's a great way to think if you have the ability to do so. And I think for great leaders, it's finding, now that I'm thinking about it, I think it was Eisenhower had that matrix where it was like things I need to think deeply about, right? Versus things I can just
day. Yeah, Eisenhower. It's like important, not important, urgent, not urgent. And it's a 4-quadrant matrix. I use it every morning in my journal to make sure like I know exactly what's a priority for that day.
Right.
It is such a great, simple, easy framework to use.
I see. Okay. Yeah. And I think that it falls perfectly into this, right? You have that balance between there's certain important things that I need to think deeply about. And I can't get this decision wrong. But then there's certain things where it's like, there's a few ways I can go. Time is of the essence. I just got to make a decision and get us moving forward.
Exactly.
And we see that with leaders all throughout history, especially generals too. Like, I got to move this army over here, this army over there, or I got to sound the alarm for a retreat. I don't have time to sit and think through things deeply. But if I'm Napoleon and I'm doing, my grand strategy on how to destroy the Austrians, take a few weeks, think through it, break it down, and make sure you come to the right decision. Because if you mess this up, many, many people are going to die, including yourself. So yeah, I think it is really the bedrock of a lot of decision making that all the leaders we talked about have come into touch with one way or another.
Yep, totally agree.
Awesome. All right, I think that's a great place to end. And thank you everybody for listening, and we'll see you all in a couple of weeks.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you for listening to today's episode of the History in Motion podcast. If you enjoyed our journey through time, please subscribe, rate us, and share the podcast with friends. Your support helps keep history alive. Until next time.